Thank you. This is exciting. Good morning, everyone. We've got a lot of people on this project, so I'd like to give a shout out to Jonathan Berant. He's at Stanford. He's a postdoc. Pei-Chun Chen was at Stanford when this work was done, and she's now at Google. We have 3 biologists on our team. Abby, Vander, Linden, and Brittany Harding are in the University of Washington. Brad Huang is in Stanford. Chris Manning's also at Stanford, but he's not a biologist. And there's me. I was a postdoc in the NLP group when this work was done, and I've since moved to the University of Utah. So let me start off with an example of the tasks that we are trying to solve. Most of us have at some point in life had to do reading comprehension, and it can be pretty hard. So if you've never done it before, here's a quick example. You're given a paragraph of text, like this one here, which talks about water being split and producing stuff. Then there's light absorption, which causes a transfer of that stuff. And you're asked a question. What can the splitting of water lead to? A, light absorption, or B, transfer of ions? What's the answer? Okay, I hear a B from someone I totally did not plant in the audience. So yeah, it is B. And the question is, why is the answer B? One way of reasoning about this is to think about the entities and the events in this paragraph. So there are 3 events here. There's a splitting event, there's an absorption event, and there's a transfer event. Splitting produces the ions that are eventually transferred, so we can connect these 2 events by a link called enable. What this means is, for transfer to happen, splitting should have happened at some point. Light absorption is more directly responsible for this transfer. It causes the transfer. Now, with this kind of a graph representation of the events, answering the question becomes somewhat easier. The answer is transfer of ions because there's a causal link from splitting to transfer. Absorption and splitting are not really connected, so we can rule out option A. This is the kind of reasoning that we want to do in this work. And so let me get to a summary of the contributions of what's going on. In this work, we've identified a new and interesting reading comprehension task that is somewhat more difficult than what you might see. It deals with biological processes, and I'll talk about what processes are in a little bit, but you can at this point think of them as a collection of events and entities that interact. To drive research in this direction, we've created a new data set called Process Bank that comes with paragraphs of text with not 1 but 2 annotations. Each paragraph is annotated with a structure, a graph that represents what's going on in the process, and a collection of multiple choice questions. Using this data set, we've created an end-to-end system that, given a paragraph and a question, we try to answer it by first predicting the structure, and then thinking of the structure as a small knowledge base. We have a question and a knowledge base, so we try to do semantic parsing. This is also an overview of the talk. I'll first talk about the data set and walk you through some of the motivation of why this data set is interesting, and then get to the actual system itself. So the data set is called Process Bank, in case you missed it. And one of the motivations for creating this data set, and indeed actually working on this kind of a problem, is the difference between micro and macro reading. I think the term comes from Tom Mitchell, I'm not sure. Macro reading is a style of information extraction that focuses on, that takes advantage of redundancy of information on huge, huge corpora. We've seen pretty cool systems that do this. We've seen TextRunner, Ollie, Reverb, and Nell, and such things. And we end up with huge, basically, databases of facts. These databases can let us do interesting things like semantic parsing for factoid questions, so we can ask questions like who's married to whom, what's the capital of a country, and such things. A very different kind of reading is called micro-reading, where we're given a single document, like your email, for example. There is little to no redundancy of information, and in order to understand the text, you need to do some kind of reasoning of what's going on. And by actually doing this kind of reasoning, it lets us answer way more difficult questions, non-factoid questions. And this is the general ballpark in which this work can be situated. In particular, we are looking at biological processes. A process is basically a collection of interacting events and the entities that participate in these events. By interacting, I mean there are causal dependencies between the events. And you see them everywhere in biology. This is just some random images that I found from Wikipedia of biological processes, and there are a lot more of them. And at some point, all of us have seen biological processes, probably in high school or something, things like photosynthesis and water cycle and such things. Processes show up not just in biology, but also in other domains, in economics, manufacturing, chemistry. Cooking's a process, I think. Shopping's certainly a process. And the nice thing about biological processes is there are abundant textual descriptions of these things. And moreover, we have exams, AP exams for really smart kids, which actually test an understanding of these processes. So these are the kinds of exams, of questions that we want to answer. So we tried to, the starting point of this work was we set out trying to create a difficult reading comprehension task. So we pulled out 200 paragraphs of text from a biology textbook, and we had two goals. First, we wanted to create somehow test an understanding of the text, of what's going on. The same way we set exams. And the second requirement, probably more or equally important, is these questions should not be easily answerable. In other words, a shallow approach should not work. That will actually push for research in understanding. The way we did this was we found an annotator and told them to basically create an exam based on these 200 paragraphs, gave them a small set of examples, and all the questions that they created were multiple choice questions, where only one of them is right. So in all, we ended up with about 600 questions, and we gave it to a different annotator and told them to answer this, take this exam basically, and they scored enough to get an A+. So the point is, this is a reasonable set of questions, and humans, or at least biologists, can do it. So just to give you a flavor of the kind of questions that we ask, we coarsely group the questions into 3 types. Some questions are dependency questions. By that I mean they test an understanding of how events and entities interact with each other in the text. And one thing I want to point out is that these interactions don't have to be in the same sentence or even in adjacent sentences. They can be really far off. Another kind of question asks about ordering of events in the text, or actually temporal ordering of events. Ordering of events in the text is easy. A third style of questions is about true or false. Basically, it's textual entailment. So these were the 3 broad classes of questions that we found in the corpus. A second layer of annotation on the same text was a structured representation of the process itself. So in our running example, we have 3 events: splitting, absorption, and transfer, and there are a bunch of entities that interact. The graph consists of events, or nodes corresponding to events, and these are the trigger nodes. Triggers are simply tokens that denote or evoke the existence of an event. The triggers, the events actually, involve entities, and these are basically semantic roles. These are spans of text in the same sentence as the trigger, and these spans are labeled with semantic roles like agent, theme, and the usual bunch. There are additional edges in this graph which indicate how these events interact with each other. We've already seen two kinds of edges, enable and cause. There is also an edge that says one event can prevent another event. There's information about whether one event is contained in another event, and also event coreference. So we end up with a connected graph of all these events and entities. How did we actually get the data? We use the same process descriptions that we used to create the questions. And the biologists annotated these questions with the structure. And there are several interesting points to point out. I just want to make two observations. One, the person who did the questions was not involved with the structure annotation. And this was a deliberate choice, and there might actually be conflicts between the question and the structure, and we wanted to preserve this conflict because we don't know anything about biology, they probably do. There are many more nuances with the annotation, and I recommend that you should check out the paper and or the supplementary material. One interesting point is that as a choice, we did not annotate any temporal relations. The hypothesis is that because we have causal interactions between events, all the relevant temporal ordering can be inferred from cause. For example, if A causes B, A should have at least started before B. Okay, so let me just quickly summarize what this data set is. Again, it's called Process Bank. It consists of 200 paragraphs from the textbook called Biology, which talks about biology. And each paragraph is a description of a biological process, and it's annotated with two kinds of information. First, there's a structured representation of the process, which consists of, again, events, entities, and interactions. And each paragraph comes with a collection of non-trivial questions, reading comprehension questions. All of them are multiple choice. Okay, so we have the data. So what do we do with it? Let me give you a brief overview of the entire system, the end-to-end system, and then talk about the guts of it. The input to the system is a paragraph of text and a question with two options. We need to pick one of those. We've seen an example already. And the way we broke up this thing is we first take the paragraph and predict a structure, the process structure. Now, looking at the structure, we have the structure and the question answers. We parse the question into formal queries, which are graph templates. And finally, we use the queries and the knowledge and the graph, which is actually a knowledge base, to answer the questions. And I'll talk about these pieces, or at least give you a flavor of what's going on in each of these. The first step is to predict the process structure. This is a structured prediction problem. And there are many ways of doing this, and I'm going to talk about some of the choices that we made. Recall that we need to predict the full graph. We are given the text, we need to predict the full graph. In other words, we need to predict the triggers, the nodes that correspond to triggers. We need to predict the arguments. We need to label the arguments and the event-event relations. We split this prediction process into two steps. First, we predict the triggers using a binary classifier that looks at every word and says, is this an event or not? And then the rest of the structure, we framed it as a joint inference problem. We could have done the whole thing jointly. And in fact, we tried it. It turned out it didn't give us much of an improvement in performance. It only took a lot longer, which kind of seemed pointless. So let me talk about the actual joint inference itself. We need to predict a graph. And at this point, we have the triggers. For each trigger, we identify a set of plausible arguments or argument candidates. And this is standard procedure in the semantic role labeling world. You look at the syntactic structure of the sentences and identify argument candidates. So you have all the nodes in the graph. Now we need to assign edge labels, and we broke up the total. In other words, we need to find a graph that has the highest score. we broke up the score into argument scores and relation scores, and we decomposed the arguments, all the scores along the edges. The argument score is basically a scoring function that says, for this argument, what's the score that it takes a certain label, like agent, theme, or source, and so on. And we have a score for every possible argument, candidate, actually. Another set of scores are for the event-event relations. For every pair of triggers, we have a scoring function that says, what is the score that this particular pair of triggers is enable or cause or prevent, and so on. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of how we solved it, but effectively, this entire inference problem is an integer linear program. And we can now do interesting things with it because we can add knowledge into the inference. We can do joint inference, or we did joint inference, using constraints that make sure that the full graph is a meaningful one from the biological process perspective. Some constraints are common in this domain, things like no arguments should overlap with each other. Some constraints introduce some knowledge about the problem into the inference. Things like constraints like the second and third one here that say an entity cannot participate in too many events. It's just common sense. An event cannot involve too many entities. Remember that the entire graph should be connected, so we enforce connectivity using flow constraints. And there are other constraints. One particular one that I want to just point out, we can add a lot more. Something that introduces knowledge into the inference. Two events that share an argument must be related. And for example, let's say one event produces something. So splitting of water produces some ions. And that's something that's produced. The entity goes on to do other things in another event. The fact that these two events are not connected is a mistake. By definition, there must be an enable edge between these two events because for event 2 to happen, event 1 must have happened. Or there must have been a cause, some sort of a event-event relation. And there are more constraints that are in the same area. I'm not going to talk about it because I should leave something for you to read. Just to wrap up the structure prediction bit, a word about where these scoring functions come from. They are basically linear models. We use standard sets of features. We train the model using structured average perceptron. We use the Gurobi ILP solver for inference, and we get exact solutions, and all is good. What we have now is basically, we've converted the structure, we've converted the input paragraph into a graph. Now, we are left with the structure and a question, and we need to answer it. So the next step is to parse the question. The question parsing step involves, as input, a question, 2 answers, and we convert each answer into a query. We define a query to be a path template, which consists of a source and a target node, and a regular expression of edge labels that can connect these. Let me give you an example. So the question that we had was, what does splitting of water lead to? Answer A effectively says, splitting of water leads to light absorption. That corresponds to the graph on top, which says there is a path from split to absorb that can only traverse through enable and super edges. Just an example. The second option says splitting of water leads to transfer of ions, which says there is a path from split to transfer that only traverses enable edges. The way we get to these path templates, we implemented a deterministic system to get this by looking at taking advantage of the fact that we already have a structure, we have all the syntactic annotation on top of the questions. So we align the tokens in the triggers and in the question and answers to the triggers and arguments of the structure. Now looking at the syntactic structure of the sentence, we identify the source and target. This is in this particular sentence, this is active voice. The question word is at an object, so the source must be from the question, and so on. Now, looking at some keywords in the sentence and expanding that set with WordNet, we are able to find the regular expression. And just to simplify things, we created a small set of regular expressions that we found to be sufficient. Then we have a graph that represents the process and 2 path templates. And now we can get about to actually answering the question. So I've removed all the entities in this example, and the answering algorithm proceeds as follows. First, we check if the path matches the graph. If the path matches the graph, or if the template matches the graph, you can think of it as evidence for why this is the right answer. Why can split lead to transfer? Because there is a path that matches that regular expression that only traverses enables or supers. Sometimes the structure matching is not great. The structure prediction is not great. So we do what most of us have done for multiple choice questions at some point. You're given 2 options. I don't know anything about the first option, but the second one's surely wrong. So let me try to look smart and pick the first one. In other words, we try to find a contradiction, an obvious contradiction. In this case, a contradiction of causality, which says that there is an edge that matches the regular expression, but the direction of that edge is wrong in the graph. So there is a causal path from split to absorb, but absorb transfer edge is in the wrong direction. So this is a refutation. It tells you that the second answer is provably incorrect. Now, sometimes nothing works, so you back off to baselines. And I'll talk about the baselines in a bit. OK, so this is the big picture of the system, and let's see how well this does. Very brief word about the experimental setup. We train on and develop on 150 processes and evaluate on 50 of them. Just to remind you, each process description might correspond to multiple questions. This is not really a baseline. It's tossing a coin gets you 50%. It only says that the data set is balanced. The most simple baseline we could think of was bag of words. Just says which of the answers is better represented in the text. It does worse than chance, which means that the person who wrote the questions did a fairly good job. We implemented 2 proximity baselines. A text proximity says which of these answers is closer to the question in the paragraph. That's slightly better than chance. We implemented a dependency proximity, which is slightly more complicated. It looks at dependency trees. And it does better, but the general message is shallow approaches don't work. What this means is that the data set that we've created, the task we've created, is actually a difficult one. In contrast, if you actually have the structure, we get a pretty big boost in performance if you have the gold structure. And predicted structures, the end-to-end system, we call it ProRead, does fairly better than all the baselines as well. So the message here is that an actual understanding of the structure and thinking of it as a knowledge base in order to do this kind of reading comprehension helps with this sort of micro-reading task. Very brief summary of error analysis. When we have predicted structures, the errors in structure prediction are actually the leading cause of problems. With gold structures, not so much. Our structure does not have any information about entity coreference, and that leads to some issues. And you can break down the problems across the different stages of the pipeline. So let me start wrapping up, and maybe we can have a discussion if you're interested, if I have time. The main point of this work is that we've created a new reading comprehension task that focuses on a nuanced understanding of text. In particular, we deal with processes. We've created a data set called process bank with 2 kinds of annotation, with both structures and reading comprehension questions. I described an end-to-end system that can do this reading comprehension, and it does fairly well. And the message is that entity and event structure is a very useful thing to have. From the bigger picture perspective, from the natural language understanding perspective, what we really want are programs that can actually reason about text. And processes, and in particular biological processes, are really complex phenomena that are extensively described in text, so they provide a great playground for this style of work. The nice thing about this kind of work is it requires a lot of NLP threads to come together. We need to have some, it ties together pieces from information extraction, semantic role labeling, semantic parsing, reading comprehension, and what is not mentioned but really important is we expect the entire syntax pipeline to work. And the good thing is this kind of data set can probably drive research towards more natural language understanding or machine reading kind of work. So I'll wrap up. I want to point out that all the code is available on the Stanford NLP website. The data set is available as well, and I encourage you to download it and have fun with it. And I'll probably stop now, so thanks, and I'll take questions.
Congratulations first. Thanks, it's very nice. I have first a comment, clarification, and then I have a question. If you look at your example, I misinterpreted or I have a very different interpretation of that paragraph. Water is split as a summary statement, and then the processes are described. And that's what defines the water splitting from the electron point of view. I may be wrong, but I think I'm pretty confident I'm correct, actually. You're not a biologist, so it's unfair, but...
No, I don't understand what you said, so...
So water is split is really the result of the second sentence, that light absorbed by the chlorophyll drives the electron transfer, which splits the water molecule into oxygen and hydrogen.
I have to put my biologist hat here.
Okay.
Actually, water is split. It creates electrons and protons, and these electrons and protons are eventually transferred from some place to someplace else to create something.
You don't think it's the light that absorbed by the chlorophyll that
okay,
creates
good.
the water
This is
splitting?
evidence that this
anyway,
is a difficult
the point
task.
I wanted to get to, I did not want to get too deep into this, is that there is a lot of knowledge outside the paragraph to really understand the paragraph and really solve the problem.
Yes.
And then you get into the fundamental dilemma. What is redundancy versus really reasoning? In other words, you can answer this question due to redundancy by learning a lot of knowledge from other texts. So I think there is a fundamental, I like the project, don't misunderstand me, but I think there is a fundamental, tricky, subtle issue.
Right. In fact, that's a very good point. And to control for that, we were very careful in the questions. We tried to make sure that there was minimal lexical variability in the question so that you don't bring in knowledge from, you don't have to bring in knowledge from elsewhere. We told the biologists to stick to biology, and if they absolutely need to bring knowledge, go for it, but try not to. And that forces us to kind of step up the NLP game. But yes, I agree with it, and here we, on purpose, push towards one direction.
Okay, other questions?
So I like very much your work. One observation is that this is basically what also IBM Watson is doing in minimal part. So it would be nice to see how the system could answer this kind of question. The other more interesting question is, so you have done this for a specific domain, a specific data set. What are the plans to make this scale to more larger domain?
So while the data set is actually domain specific, nothing in the algorithmic approach is domain specific. In theory, all of this can scale to other domains. The motivation, one of the motivations was, let's say I give you a textbook, can we solve the questions at the end of the book? Any textbook. Really ambitious, but that was sort of a point that we kept in mind all the time. So we tried not to tailor anything to biology. There were some features that we pulled up that might have been biology specific, but those are really easy to generalize.
Yeah, so it would be nice if you can create another data set and then do cross-domain validation.
That would be fun.
Thank you very much.
One more question.
So if I've understood you correctly, the regular expressions, of which you have a simple example on the slide, constitute a theory of causality from which you're drawing conclusions. How good is that theory of causality, and do you have anything to say about its limitations?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure what exactly I can say about the theory of causality there. This is basically one of those things that needs to be tried to get a better understanding. But yeah, you're right. I don't know what to say exactly. It's just a good question.
That's a good answer. Thank you.